On this episode of Reel It In, we've got a lot of valuable and inspiring information. We'll be reviewing some episodes of podcasts that had some very successful people on discussing their techniques to success. These are the types of things that we can start doing ourselves right now. A lot of ideas about how focusing on the present in the right way can help shape a better future for both ourselves and our society as a whole. Today's episode, how to take back control of your future. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Reel It In, the only podcast that brings you 10 podcasts from the week in under an hour. I went through over 30 different podcasts this week and handpicked 10 which I think are the most relevant to helping you stay up to date and involved in the zeitgeist that we're all a part of, collective learning, evolution, and growth. Welcome to Reel It In.
Oh, wait, you're listening.
You're listening to Radio Lab. And Radio Lab.
All right, on this week's show, we have Fresh Air with Terry Gross, the Duncan Trussel Family Hour, The Life Coach, How I Built This, Hidden Brain, The Stuff You Should Know, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, Accidental Creative, Tiny Leaps, and Stuff to Blow Your Mind. Let's get into it. On Fresh Air with Terry Gross, this week on August 13th, she had Christopher Lenard on, talking about his new book, Kochland, that's K-O-C-H, Kochland, The Secret History of the Koch Brothers and Corporate Power in America. Charles and David Koch are famous because of the wealth they've accumulated through Koch Industries. Together they're worth over $100 billion. They're also famous for creating a powerful political influence network, which is designed to amplify their messages and support legislation that favors their needs and goals, while also defeating legislation which gets in the way of their profits. The core of Koch Industries is in the fossil fuel industry, and the brothers have been fighting against greenhouse emission regulations for decades. According to Lenard's new book, Charles Koch also has been in the process of remaking the Republican Party. Lenard explains that Koch Industries are the hidden giant of the economy. Everything they make is embedded throughout our entire infrastructure. They have a hand in basically everything. Most notably is their base in oil and natural gas refineries. They're also involved with things like how you make your walls and nitrogenated soil, which is what most of our food comes from. And they're basically in everything, and their brand name remains invisible. Their average revenues are larger than Facebook, Goldman Sachs, and U.S. Steel combined. On top of this, they have the largest lobbying entity in the U.S. They have a massive level of influence over our public policy and laws. They're a firm that's always looking to acquire, reinvest, and grow. They're basically like a giant pool of capital. Their secret weapons are long-term planning and patience. Around the year 2000, they instilled something they call a corporate veil, which basically puts a wall around a company. So if that company goes broke, whoever it owes money to can only get assets from that company. Basically, Koch Industries creates hundreds of different corporate entities, and they use these entities to buy up other companies and do their other bidding. But all the while, Koch Industries is safe because each of their smaller entities is separated by the corporate veil. Everything the Koch brothers do is technically legal. That's to say that they're masters of complex systems like these oil refinery plants and these economic dealings. And our legal system is also a complex machine. The things that they do seem to redefine legality, and sometimes it takes up to 10 years to determine if the law was actually broken. They play right up to the edge of breaking the law, as well as manipulate loopholes. They're also stretched into the stock market. Lenard says that trading is the heart of Koch Industries. They have many skilled traders who are aware of the way the world works. They could jump on a great deal, buy huge amounts of these goods, and then wait for the market to shift slightly and sell them for a lot more. Their most powerful commodity isn't oil, but it's actually information. They bought an entire natural gas company just to gather information through them about United States energy usage. They gather and use all sorts of information to predict energy usage. They make huge amounts of money by knowing what the U.S. is going to need and how much things will be worth in different times. But they're also one of the most polluting companies in the U.S. They spend tons of resources to push back and hold back legislation which helps the environment. This is one of the corporations that's making money off of all the fracking and making these pipelines and all these other things that we know are terrible for the environment. The idea of a carbon tax could have a significant effect on the Koch brothers and also on the world's health. In 2009, Congress introduced the Waxy Marquee bill, but Koch saw it as a threat to their company, and their lobbyists target whoever supports these bills. Koch Industries has an unrivaled political apparatus. It's a multifaceted machine which has a massive influence on Congress. They do all sorts of tricky things like facilitating what appear to be populist movements by orchestrating people and using their personal influence to affect lawmakers. They even train people to call in radio shows and have reports made by certain think tanks that will say that if we make certain changes to help with greenhouse emissions, it's going to destroy the economy and bring us into some sort of Mad Max post-apocalyptic nightmare. And then they have other think tanks make more reports, which end up reinforcing the first ones, and then more think tanks get on it, and then they advertise these results in political ads. It's an extremely manipulative corporation. As soon as anybody talks about climate issues, they attack them, support their competitors, and basically get these people voted out of Congress. Charles Koch has a specific idea of how he wants the country to work, and he won't compromise. However, in this era of Trump, there's a new contender battling for the control of the Republican Party. For right now, Koch is still controlling and directing them, but Trump has a different vision of the role of the White House. Lenard says that Trump did, in effect, upturn the political table when he got elected. Even still, Koch Industries are getting a lot of their policy preferences, mostly tax-related things that still end up benefiting the Koch brothers. Check out that book, Kochland, check out the podcast, and hopefully spreading of this information will help us solve the problem. I remain optimistic. I believe that people are becoming more active and more aware and are just too smart to let this kind of thing keep happening.
Yes, sir. We are here with Johnny.
This week on the Duncan Trussel Family Hour, his guest was Charles Eisenstein, a public speaker, philosopher, and author of a lot of books, the most recent of which is about climate change. Duncan says this episode can, quote, melt some of the fear that may be sizzling around the frying pan of our brain, end quote. They discuss how the term apocalypse actually means a great unveiling. Charles describes that alongside the fear of a collapse of our current system, there's also a sense of, bring it on. That a lot of people actually feel imprisoned by this world that we've created. Whether it be from debt, relationships, politics, a lot of people just want out. Charles says that maybe this is why we're all half-heartedly participating, that we're actually sowing the seeds for the meltdown. People are doing this, but at the same time, not causing the meltdown or preparing for what's going to come next. Instead of prepping for some kind of post-apocalyptic collapse, try and be part of bringing in a better future, the better future, which we all know is possible. Duncan asks, but how do I stop using so much plastic, for example? Charles says it's not about how much actual plastic we're using, but where we are, quote, putting our life energy and what we are aligning with, end quote. He says instead of saying, wow, I'm so bad, I'm so wasteful, that we should say, every opportunity to get better, I'm going to take the opportunity. He says everyone who has that orientation of choosing to take every opportunity that presents itself in order to become better and more sustainable, then we would move forwards as a whole. He says it's not just about personal decisions, but we're all kind of stuck in this world. Almost everybody feels trapped, but compelled to go along with it. They say if everyone simply decides to take the opportunity to regenerate, to better themselves and heal themselves or the planet, then we'd start to see a real shift. Charles says it's already happening, and certain ideas and lifestyles that used to be normal are now becoming out of place. He says the consciousness shift is happening, but it's also what's causing everyone to feel alienated and powerless. Basically, no matter how much we reject the world, we still have to pay the debts. Even third world countries are having to pay their debts. Otherwise, they get systemically punished. He says we're living in a, quote, legacy system built on old consciousness, end quote. But the consciousness is changing. It's, quote, hollowing out from the inside, but there's a shell still there, end quote. He's hoping for that shell to become more fragile and crack and rupture. Ideally, since none of us are very bought into that old system anymore, it will likely fall. He says the old system is no longer resilient and that a shock could cause it to collapse. He said that people would all be inclined to build something new from the wreckage, not to recreate it, since a lot of us were actually hoping for it to be destroyed anyway. That's why proper prepping and future seed planting is important. He says anything with the word alternative or holistic are seeds for the future, and they could become the new normal. I have to say, I totally agree. Duncan asks, isn't just waiting for collapse cowardly and lazy? And Charles says it's not just about waiting, it's about participating. And also preparing for the new world, which happens to hasten the demise of the old one. Anytime you help the world preserve resources, or restore community, or connect people with herbal medicine, you're empowering them, making them not just helpless consumers, and also hurting economic growth. The current system needs economic growth to survive. Helping people hurts business and accelerates the collapse that would foster in the change. Charles also says if you can take away the element or idea that there's some evil individual or evil force behind all of this, then it actually solves some of the aggression and alienation. Charles says this is keeping the status quo operating. Everyone is so focused on finding and destroying the enemy instead of actually changing the conditions that constantly generate an endless supply of enemies. He says the actual search for the cause of the issue is distracting us from solving it ourselves. He says our hopelessness is not taking into account the amazing things like the countless synchronicities that prove there's higher forces and the magic of healing energy and the feats of Qigong masters. He says that some synchronicities or experiences like healing are too mind-blowing to explain. And even if you can rationally explain them and explain all this miracle stories, that there's still too many. They add up and they prove that there's something more happening that science doesn't really publicly discuss. Duncan says if you come out with this stuff, the scientific community will chastise you and cut your funding and rub you out. Charles says that the synchronicities and miracles are all proof that, quote, intelligence is not limited to human beings, and it is present in all things and in the world, and that there is an inconceivable mystery going on here. An intelligence that pervades all things, that pervades the events of our lives, and when we look back and we realize that everything is perfect. Maybe you can call it God, end quote. Charles explains that if not for the imperfections, then there wouldn't be any perfection. It's perfect because there's an emerging order and a direction to the cosmos. The things that seem like faults are actually motivations for us to do things and make change. Charles describes chaos theory a bit, and that matter has organization within it. The matter is conscious and that the world and the universe are all alive. He says, quote, what we call awareness of self is an emerging property. It's like a landmark in a new stage of complexity and becomes a takeoff point for even further advances in complexity, which is what is happening now on a global level as the collective mind emerges, end quote. Charles says his work is about making the unconscious choice conscious. Do we want to serve a living planet or a dead planet? It's not about survival. It's about what kind of world are we creating or destroying. He says it takes courage to align with a different principle. Rather than survival or self-interest, serving life is aligning with the principle of a gift. It's the departure from what we have been programmed to be. He says this courage comes from community, having people around us that can sense the truth inside of us. What they see inside of us is, quote, no matter how cynical and traumatized we've become, there is a living spark inside of us that wants to burst into passionate flame in service to the life and beauty of this planet. Anything that is in service to life is a possible expression for your reason for being here, end quote. Very inspiring and motivating talk. You should definitely go back and check out the whole episode. It's not too long and it's full of really motivating and inspiring stuff. The Life Coach with Brooke Castillo is an awesome self-improvement show. This week's episode was called Gifts to My Future Self. Brooke says that when you think of your future self, you're establishing a connection and a relationship with that self. It could be a self from 5 minutes in the future or 5 years in the future, any amount of time. She says you have this relationship with yourself based on the thoughts that you think about yourself. How you think about yourself determines how you feel about yourself and in general, and that in turn determines what you do. It's important to think about yourself in the right way. She gives a few examples of the many concepts that she's taught throughout her podcasts in regards to treating yourself well and being careful with your thoughts. So since our relationship with ourself is so important, it's important to expand this relationship with our present self and to have a mindful, positive relationship with our future self as well. She said a good technique is writing letters to yourself. Write from your current being to your past self as a warm-up, and then imagine that past self writing a letter to us now. Then another day from your future self to you now. And then when you're ready, write one from your present self to your future self. Once you've done those more preparatory letters, it'll be more meaningful. And she says this is one of the most practical and meaningful things that you can do. She said she used to do it 10 years ago, and now she's become that self. And it's a really successful and awesome self. So she's got a really good relationship with her past and present self and her future self to come. She says your relationship with yourself is the most important relationship in your life. How you act, talk, and think to yourself is vital to your fulfillment. Focusing on yourself and paying attention to yourself is not self-indulgent. She said if we focus on the external too much, then we end up having nothing to offer. We have to start with ourselves. If you have a great relationship with all of your different selves, future, past, and present, then you'll have the best life possible. So she says hook your future self up. You'll be grateful. It's time to shift away from the instant gratification mindset. She says to examine prioritizing your future self over your present self. Manage, allow, and accumulate urges without giving in to them. When you delay gratification, your future self will reap the benefits. She says examine what gifts are we receiving from the past now, and then ask what do you want to give as a gift to your future self? Do you love them enough to start giving now? You can also apply this to your kids and loved ones. Start paying attention to them in the present with a plan for how it's going to reward them in the future. Exercise, yoga, more health checkups, dental care, good diet, saving money, avoiding debt. These are all great examples of gifts that you can give yourself in the future. This definitely can apply to business things as well. Things that may not be very fun now can be more rewarding in the future. You can delay financial gain, and it'll literally pay in the future. Planning your time well and avoiding procrastination also helps. One of the best ways to do this is to love your future self and think about your future self like you would one of your best friends. Further in the future you look, the more elaborate and exciting gifts you can give yourself. She says after writing the letters, then make a list of gifts you want to give to your future self. Let your present self serve as a bridge for the past self who you're grateful for and the future self who you're excited about. You live in great happiness when you're in this state. She points out that it's very hard to focus on yourself, but it's really important for your future, and it will eventually enable you to offer more to the world. Once you're kind to yourself, you'll find that that's actually the hardest person to be kind to, and then it becomes easier to care about everybody else. Great advice from Brooke Castillo, as always. NPR's How I Built This with Guy Raz is a show where he gets into the stories behind some of the world's best-known companies. They also talk about different innovators, entrepreneurs, idealists, and how they built the things that they did build. This week's episode, serial entrepreneur Marcia Kilgore. Marcia's story is super inspiring. She was 18 years old, moved to New York City with $300 in her pocket, and ended up making 5 different super successful businesses. When she came to New York City, her sister was supposed to pay for her college, but circumstances changed and she no longer could. So now Marcia didn't really have any direction or plan. She was very fit, oftentimes going to the gym, and she ends up signing up for her local gym, where she ended up becoming a personal trainer. While she was doing that, she was having all kinds of issues with acne and stuff like that, and realized that her personal experiences getting facials were problematic and that she could start a business doing facials the right way. So she starts doing facials and offering it to her personal training clients, and eventually word spreads through the grapevine and more people hear about her really good facial skill, and she ends up acquiring a bunch of model clients. Eventually she starts getting celebrity clients like all the time, all because her technique was very thorough and she would always do the best job she could. Eventually this became a business, and she bought business space and had over 5 people working there. A little later, they opened in an even bigger location, and after only 3 years total, she was given a massive multi-million-dollar offer for 70% of her shares from a larger company. She took the offer, then she sold the company again, her remaining shares, to a hotel chain for even more money. 3 months after this, she ended up getting right back to work and made another company. This is because she's constantly having good ideas and acting on them. The next company provides designer-quality cosmetic products for affordable prices. And then she went and started another company. She says it's always good to have your main project and a side hustle. So a year later, she designs another company, which was all based around one shoe. She came up with an idea, got the prototype made, and started pitching it to different larger companies. All of a sudden, Bath & Body Works says, yeah, we'll buy your product, and we'll buy $300,000 a year. This woman's story is incredible and so inspiring. After all this success, she keeps on going and starts another project, more of a passion project, Guy interrupts his fourth story by saying, why do you actually keep doing it? What keeps her going more and more? Guy interrupts the fourth story asking why she keeps doing it. She says because it's so fun and exciting, and also because of the companionship she has, and that she's able to make people feel happy. She says she gets the biggest buzz from their ability to communicate that happiness back to her. She says her best strategy is she keeps things in simple terms, and she says at some point you have to decide, I deserve this, why not me? And if you're willing to work that hard, take the success that comes with it. She says it's really hard for many people, but she's managed to overcome it. At the end, she mentions that she has a few new ideas in the works already, and in fact, there was a fifth idea that they ran out of time for on the episode. Marcia Kilgore, an amazing individual. Her 5 businesses are Bliss, Soap and Glory, Fit Flop, Super Duper, and Beauty Pie. This is a great episode to listen to inspire you in a lot of ways, and to help you be more successful. This episode definitely inspired and supported me in my path. I think it's a must listen for anyone trying to make money or have any kind of success. This week on NPR's Hidden Brain, they did another episode in their annual summer series, You 2.0, a series which focuses on bettering ourselves. This episode called Your Better Nature, with Shankar Vendatam. He starts off by pointing out that our shift from forest life to highways and cities has been very fast and dramatic. On this episode, he has psychologist Ming Kuo on. She says the research shows that zoo animals die in alarming rates. It's a thing called habitat selection theory. It says that we're wired for whatever habitat we evolved in. So zoo animals do better in their natural habitat or something representing it, physically, psychologically, and in terms of social behaviors. Some researchers wonder if this would also be true for humans. Our natural environment where we evolved was in the forests of Africa. The question is our separation from this akin to a zebra living in a cage? Ming set out to do research on the negative side of living in the city, but the results of her data were so compelling, she was forced to change perspective and change her focus. In fact, she was skeptical of these ideas, but then her research gave her no choice but to change her mind. And what is this idea she's now forced to focus on? The idea that there are patterns seen with a human's ability to enjoy nature in their lives or not having the opportunity. A.O. Wilson said, quote, organisms, when housed in unfit habitats, undergo social, psychological, and physical breakdown, end quote. She says that this is what we're seeing in people. She says giving people more access to nature increases the social, psychological, and physical aspects of their lives. She said that in her research, she saw much more social breakdown in places that didn't have grass or trees, and more aggression than in the buildings with more nature surrounding them. She references something called attention restoration theory, which says that when people don't have access to nature, they become mentally fatigued. She said her research and further research into police records prove this to be true. They said that some places in Chicago that were intervened with, which is being made more green, saw over a 9% reduction in gun assaults alone. Now, beyond a lack of nature just leading to crime and social breakdown, there also seems to be a connection between greenery and health markers for obesity, hypertension, and diabetes. She says that looking at green landscapes will lower your heart rate and shift us from fight or flight mode to tend to befriend mode. Her research shows that health changes really are directly related to greenness. She said that the pharmacies that are in less green areas actually sell substantially more mood-stabilizing drugs than the ones in green areas. Also, there's a direct relationship with greenery and our immune strength. Research shows that there's a measurable increase in killer cells just after 3 days in nature, an average boost of 50%. Ming says, quote, nature seems to be like a multivitamin. You can get different benefits from different kinds of exposure, but to get all of them, you kind of have to be there. She said she applies this to her own life by walking to and from campus now, with her eyes always on the canopy. She said it makes a real difference for her. So everybody, be sure to get outside every now and then.
Welcome to Stuff You Should Know, a production of iHeartRadio's How Stuff Works.
This week on Stuff You Should Know, solar power, the future, or what? Josh Clark and Charles W. Chuck Bryant start off by saying that the major proponents of solar seem to be losing steam, or maybe realizing that it hasn't taken off like they expected, or that they're worried. But contrary to this, it turns out that the numbers show that the market for solar power is and has been steadily growing for a number of years. They say that 18 days of global sunlight produces the same amount of energy that's stored in the entirety of the planet's reserves of coal, oil, and natural gas. So if you dug up and burned all of the coal, oil, and natural gas, it's only as much energy as 18 days of global sunlight. So there's a lot of energy coming off the sun. Also, solar power has 0 greenhouse gases. They say it was a French physicist who was the first one to demonstrate the ability of a solar cell to turn sun into electricity, and that was back in 1839. In the 1880s, Charles Fritz made the first rooftop solar array, which was terribly inefficient. They say the U.S. government and military funded a lot of the early research, which is what led to solar-powered satellites, and the first one was launched in 1958. In the 70s, President Jimmy Carter famously got solar panels in the White House, but then Reagan had them removed, which people believed was due to his fossil fuel ties. There was more back and forth from president to president in regards to the use of solar in the White House, and tax breaks being offered and then rescinded and offered again. But these days, solar is way more available. It's actually dropped 88% in price in the past decade because of advancing technologies. Also, solar always pays for itself in the long run. Solar cells are currently using silicon because it's a semiconductor which lets us control the flow of electricity. They proceed to explain in more detail in a fun way exactly how the solar panels work, and they mention that they last for an average of 20 to 25 years. They say when you're ready for solar, there's a few things you should do first. The first is do an energy audit, figuring out how much energy you're going to use, especially at peak times. They say this energy audit will also help you make your energy consumption more efficient. They get into some detail about some other tips, and they strongly recommend figuring some things out on your own before hiring people to help. Next, they start talking about solar roof tiles, and these are little solar tiles that you can cover your whole roof in, and they're much more visibly appealing, but they're also way more expensive. Tesla makes some of these too. They said that they're so expensive it would take a really long time for the roof to actually pay for itself. After this, they start getting a little more into detail about solar panel efficiency and ways to make them more efficient and more affordable. And they explain that if you have solar and you're producing more energy than you use, you actually can get a check from the power company. They also talk a bit about home batteries and even these solar-powered hydroelectric batteries. They do also mention some downsides, like the cost of transporting and mining certain materials. But once they are built, there's no more use of greenhouse gas forever. They also say once the current limitations are fixed, a lot of these issues will go away. Through short-term breakthroughs, we're going to overcome these current front-loaded obstacles. They say solar is still better anyway, despite the added greenhouse emissions, because when you compare it to the fossil fuel emissions in the same time period, it's still way cleaner. And once we upgrade transportation to a more clean energy-based, solar-based system, then it's going to balance things out as well. Solar and wind plants are decentralized because plants have to be in certain places that they can harvest these energies. So there's other complications as well about transporting the electricity. Other restrictions like weather have to be accounted for, but there's lots of solutions, and technological advances are going to make these solutions much more possible. One would be batteries, but for now it's just not economically feasible. Speaking of economically feasible, there's estimates that say it would cost about $4 trillion to convert the whole energy to solar and clean energy. But if everybody started getting their own solar arrays and did everything they could to help, it's going to make it a much less costly and lengthy conversion. Really entertaining talk. If you have any interest at all in solar energy, I would definitely check it out. I believe in it. I think we're going to see clean energy start to really penetrate in the next 5-10 years, and especially beyond that.
You're listening to the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, your escape to reality.
The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe is a show that focuses on critical thinking. They look at some current news articles and use their knowledge, understanding, and scientific intellect to help their listeners get more out of the news. This week's episode, video game violence, public trust in scientists, robot workers, new type of star, and detecting planet cores. The first thing they start discussing is that there was recently 2 different mass shootings, and about how immediately after a mass shooting, the media starts going crazy looking for what they call the, quote, real cause. Of the many possibilities of this cause, one very powerful one is video game violence. Some research says no matter how you look at it, There seems to be a correlation between engaging in video game violence and increased aggression, decreased empathy for victims of aggression, and decreased pro-social behavior. There is, however, another school of thought. In that school, the researchers say that there is only an effect when you include mild forms of aggression, but not actual physical aggression. And the more significant the aggression, the more decrease there is in the correlation, down to almost zero for violent criminal behavior. In the end, there is a correlation of aggression and video game violence, but there's no evidence to claim that it's a major factor in the shootings happening. The next story is that apparently public trust that scientists are working in our favor is rising. Public confidence has increased over the past few years. In 2016, 21% of adults had great confidence that scientists were acting in the public's best interest, and now it's 35% in 2019. She goes on to present a bunch of other comparative statistics and percentages, definitely some interesting stuff there worth checking out. One of those statistics is that compared to 35% faith in scientists, Americans have less than 20% faith in religious leaders, and even half than that in the news media, and then elected officials even less than half of that. The next story is about the idea of people's jobs being replaced by automation. Recently, 3 researchers went out to see if there was a measurable, predictable set of worries attached to the idea that robots are displacing human jobs. They tested a bunch of different scenarios, and they found different results on how people handled losing the job. How they reacted to losing it to a human versus losing it to a robot. They'd rather lose a job to a robot than to a human, but they'd rather see a human lose a job to a human than a robot. They did a bunch of other variables on the research, and it's worth checking out the article to get some more details. I personally think automation is good. If it's properly controlled, it gives us time to focus on more important tasks, like astronomy. The next story is about a newly identified and discovered star, a hot subdwarf pulsator. It's about 1/10 the size of our sun, but incredibly hot. It also pulses way more intensely and way more often than our sun and than lots of other stars. And apparently all stars pulsate in varying degrees. The next article they talked about was about cores of exoplanets. Apparently the cores of dying exoplanets can last long enough to form a, quote, detectable circuit with their white dwarf star companion, which makes distinctive radio waves which we can detect, end quote. Apparently there's tons of white dwarf solar systems, more than even main sequence stars. Also, last year, our list of known white dwarfs was increased by 10 times after we had more data added to our data pool. After they spent about an hour talking about these articles, they had a bunch of listener questions and answers, and a couple of games that they played. Science or fiction was one. I don't think I'm going to get into the details of describing their games. You should just check it out. It's a great podcast. They touch on a lot of current articles and break them down in a lot of relevant ways. I would give it a listen, especially if any of these topics are interesting. They got into a lot more depth than I did in this brief outline. This week on Accidental Creative with Todd Henry, The Cauldron of Creative Conflict on August 12th. Todd Henry, the author of many books, including The Accidental Creative, talks about how many cultures and organizations are set up around harmony. He says part of this harmony is actually healthy conflict, and healthy conflict is a sign of a healthy team. He's mostly talking about in a work environment or organization, but this also can be applied to any other type of social context, which is another point he makes throughout the podcast. He says if you want good work done, you need divergent views, and people who are willing to fight for, argue for, and defend their perspective, even if it disagrees with whoever's in power. At the end, everyone must rally together and align, but conflict does have its place. When there's no conflict on a team, one of these is usually true. That within the team there's no accountability, which means nobody feels like there's a reason to bring their perspective to the table. People don't feel permission to speak their mind, or people just don't care, which means they have no reason to fight for anything. Any of these are bad signs of any kind of work team or other type of productive team. He describes different ways to handle conflict when it does happen. First, he points out that some people will argue and fight just to do it. But in the case when there is legit creative differences between two people on a team, the first step in dealing with it the best is to make sure the people who are fighting about the same thing. Sometimes when you peel back the layers of conflict, you find that the fight is about two different things. He says the next step is to agree on commonalities rather than focusing on differences. Finding the common ground, putting yourself in their shoes, and finding empathy. He says, quote, seek to understand the other person's point of view before you seek to destroy it, end quote. The next rule is only have conflict over ideas, not personality. He means you can't let the conflict be personal. Good conflict doesn't come from arguing about not liking ideas because of the presenter or the style which they present the ideas. If the idea is good, we should not create conflict around it. He says the moment the conflict gets personal, everybody loses. Creative conflict is about work or progress, but not fighting. Divergent ideas are necessary. He says the best ideas come out of times when one is conflicted. Resolution comes from the work done during the conflict, internal or external. Quote, brilliance is forged in the cauldron of conflict, end quote. He advises not to avoid conflict, but rather to have the courage to walk through the conflict and take the time required to find the resolution. Instead of rushing through these situations, we should really dig into them and see why they're happening and what we can learn from them, and find those resolutions within them to utilize this conflict to make the best out of our projects or situations that we can. He says make sure you engage in conflict when it comes up. It brings people together and it causes bonding too. People can see through the conflict that there's something bigger that everybody's working towards. And that's the kind of teamwork that we want. Yeah, great stuff. I totally agree. We got to speak our mind. We can't be passive aggressive. And if we're going to get anywhere, we have to speak our truth and, not avoid conflict, but use it to help us grow.
Big changes.
Tiny Leaps, Big Change is a show by Greg Clunes, which helps with different things you could change about yourself to better yourself. This week's show is called Do This to Take Control of Your Day. It's really relevant for people who get stuck or feel stagnated or overwhelmed and have lots of big ideas and goals, but despite this, every day flies by with no progress made. He says the biggest fix is to take control and stop living unconsciously. We need to raise awareness of how we spend time, money, and what we put into our body. Taking control in any area of life is taking control is about being aware of and paying attention to any area of life. One powerful way to achieve this is by controlling our mornings. He says a lot of people discuss morning routines, and it's because it works. The beginning of our day will influence how we feel for the rest of our day. He said it's not about if we have control, but it's about the perception. You need to come at it from a good angle, an optimistic perspective. When you first wake up, anything is possible. It's really up to us. But how it's going to play out is greatly affected by our morning. When we wake up and do something with ourselves, it makes a big difference. When we stay in the whirlwind of just reacting to everyone else in our lives, we never actually have the time to take control. Taking that morning routine, which can be basic and just as short as a few minutes, it gives us a sense of control, and it gives us that time that's purely for us, instead of everybody else in our lives who are just pulling us every direction. Also, doing this helps us to optimize for our most focused moments. Greg said his research shows that later on in the morning, once our body temperature returns, is when we hit peak mental clarity and alertness. So if we start our mornings in a state of preparation, then we will be ready for that peak moment when it comes. Lastly, it gives you some space to actually make decisions, the time and space to think and align with your goals and plan for the day. So he lists 6 things that help us to prepare for a morning routine. Thing 1, pick a single habit that we want to try out. Simple thing. He gives examples like drinking a whole cup of water every morning or meditating. The second thing is set an alarm to do that thing. Set it for about 15 minutes after you'd normally wake up. The third is commit to that single habit for a whole month and don't even add anything else new. Then, after a month, pick a second habit and commit to that for a month. Then a third and a fourth, and eventually you'll be phasing in an entirely new routine. The idea is to phase it in this way to adjust for the lifestyle changes that will be required to make this change. Then you make sure that these particular habits are worthwhile for you. Be aware of how things are making you feel and if they're adding value to you or not. He recommends meditation, drinking water, journaling, exercise, and stretching as potential first habits. It's a really cool podcast. I would check it out if I were you, if you want to become a better person, which I think that we all do, or at least it's my opinion that we probably should. This week on Stuff to Blow Your Mind with Robert Lamb and Joe McCormick, Chariots of the Gods. It was an episode they aired this week, but it was actually a From the Vault episode, but I still decided to cover it. They start off discussing themed amusement parks and start discussing that there's one in Interlaken, Switzerland, which is centered around the ideas and writing of Eric von Däken and his oddly titled book, Chariots of the Gods, with a question mark at the end, which Joe and Robert found pretty humorous. The theme park has multiple exhibits and live shows addressing the mysteries of ancient history and possible answers to be found in ancient astronaut hypotheses. The park has exhibits focusing on the Nazca lines and the constructions of the pyramids and other noted, quote, examples of ancient astronaut speculation. So the book, Chariots of the Gods, was a 1968 book that basically says ancient astronauts visited Earth and served as early god figures in our mythology. They also taught us things like how to make bread and build pyramids, among countless other things. He has some pretty simple arguments like that we weren't technologically able to build the things that we built, and other stuff looking at artistic imagery which shows that what appears to be spaceships and stuff like the Nazca lines, which are giant lines throughout the Earth which are too big for anybody to see from on Earth. He also references a specific carving in a Mayan temple in Palenque, which apparently depicts a man inside of a spaceship, or what appears to be a complicated ship of some sort. Next, he discusses some scripture. One example, the author was the prophet Ezekiel, and he writes about a vision he had one day when the sky was opened, and, quote, I'm going to speed this quote up. Quote, then I looked, and behold, a whirlwind was coming out of the north, a great cloud with raging fire engulfing itself, and brightness was all around it, and radiating out of its midst, like the color of amber out of the midst of the fire. Also from within it came the likeness of 4 living creatures. They had the likeness of a man, one had 4 faces, and each one had 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were the soles of calves' feet. They sparkled like the color of burnished bronze. Now as I look at the living creatures, behold, a wheel is on the earth beside each living creature with its 4 faces. The appearance of the wheels and their workings are like the color of beryl, and all 4 had the same likeness. The appearance of their working was, as it were, of a wheel in the middle of a wheel. When they moved, they went towards any of the 4 directions. They did not turn aside when they want. As for the rims were so high, they were awesome, and the rims were full of eyes all around the 4 of them. The question is, did the author really see this? And if he did, was it real, or was it a dream, or imagination, or drugs, or a religious trance? I ask, who's to say it wasn't real even if they were in a trance or on mushrooms? Von Daken says it's aliens and not gods, because Ezekiel gives such a detailed description of its landing. This book is what brought ancient alien theory into the mainstream back in the late 1960s. H.P. Lovecraft was another author who seeded these ideas, describing ancient beings that lived on Earth before us. Apparently the first writing to explore this was an 1888 book that says Martians had built the pyramids. They go on to list a bunch of other books and films with ancient alien references, and they talk about if the gods are rebranded aliens or aliens are just rebranded gods. I might want to point out that alien just means not of Earth, so I don't even think that there's much of a distinction. After this, they go on to read criticisms of the Chariots of the Gods, and then after that they start to discuss Carl Sagan in his book Intelligent Life in the Universe. The book says that if there is a civilization capable of interstellar travel, it would be something they're not likely to pass up. They say communication would be sluggish, they do some math, and say contacts would be made randomly, and each star would be visited every 100,000 years. Also, quote, each communicative technological civilization should be visited by another about once every 1,000 years, end quote. Therefore, it is possible that a starship may have come by the planet during the earliest stages of intelligent life on Earth. Sagan does say that, unfortunately, there is no hard evidence. There is one story from ancient Sumeria that may be a good example of potential contact. The story describes Berosus, who, in the time of Alexander the Great, had access to very ancient pictograms. They describe the history of Babylon and how these beings from the water had come and instructed them and given them all sorts of information. They go on to give some really good quotes about these descriptions. You really got to check out the second half of this episode to hear that stuff. It's really interesting and perspective broadening. In conclusion, they say it's possible that Earth has been visited, maybe many times, and they may even have a base in our solar system, like possibly on the moon. Sagan did actually write again later, saying that belief in ancient alien theory is quasi-religious, and it's probably a result of people's religious needs. The takeaway from the host is that it is possible that ancient aliens had a big part in our development, but you have to be careful about how much time and energy you want to commit to this, and if you do decide to make it your religion, not to call it science. Wow, what a week. The big takeaway, I would say, is that if we're not happy with the system that we're in, we need to prepare properly for a different kind of future. If this system is going to collapse, we need to do what we can to help hasten that and prepare for what's to come. Otherwise, we still need to do everything we can to be ready for anything. We have to act. We can't just wait. We can't be disenfranchised and not do anything about it. We also have to be aware of the role of energy in this country and how we get energy, and be aware of the presence of Koch Industries and how influential they are on the U.S. economy and government. A really powerful tool in this ongoing feud is going to be solar power, which has great potential to shift our economy and the trajectory of where we're headed in this whole climate crisis. But in order for that to work, we need people like Koch Industries to get on board. We also have to do what successful people like Charles Koch and Marcy Kilgore do. We need to be thinking about the future all the time and being focused and being determined and doing what we can in the present to make the best reality for our future selves. This way we can plant seeds for a better future all around and put these ideas into action. Another good way to get here is with a strong morning routine. Also, not to be afraid of good creative conflict. In these days, it's best to be aware and focused, to avoid the instant gratification mindset and trap. It's important to open our minds to new ideas while still staying grounded. One of the best things we can do for ourselves is to be good to ourselves, to love ourselves, to be kind to ourselves, and to cultivate a healthy relationship with ourselves in all times, past, present, and future. We can use this to fortify us as we work to have the best life we can. Well, I hope this episode is going to help your life be at least a little bit better. And be sure to check out all the episodes that were featured in this one, as well as other editions of all of those shows. Really amazing podcasters. I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to be here and distill and share this information. And we'll see you next week with more valuable info. Thanks.